North Africa, November 1942. Dawn breaks over the Tunisian hills with a copper glow that promises heat before noon. An American Sherman tank commander named Lieutenant Robert Hayes sits motionless in his turret, binoculars pressed against his eyes, scanning the ridge 2-0 yards ahead. He's been in theater for 11 days. His crew is green. His tank is new. And somewhere beyond that ridge, German panzers are waiting. Hayes lowers the binoculars and glances down at a small metal box, bolted to the interior wall of his turret. It's no larger than a lunch pail, unremarkable, almost invisible among the radios, ammunition racks, and instrument panels. But in the next 72 hours, that box will save his life 3 times. It will change how American armor fights, and it will expose a truth that German tank commanders had refused to believe since the first Sherman rolled off the assembly line in Lima, Ohio. The Americans weren't just building more tanks, they were building them smarter. If you want to understand how industrial democracy defeated fascist engineering, stay with us because this is the story of the device that almost no one remembers but everyone depended on. The Sherman tank entered combat with a reputation it didn't deserve. By late 1942, it had already been dismissed by British tankers as undergunned, by American ordnance officers as underarmored, and by German intelligence as unworthy of serious concern. The Panzer III and Panzer IV had dominated European battlefields for 3 years. German tank doctrine emphasized firepower, frontal armor, and crew survivability. Their machines were built like fortresses. American tanks, by contrast, looked like compromises. Thinner armor, smaller guns, riveted hulls. But buried in the design philosophy of the M4 Sherman was something the Wehrmacht had overlooked. The Americans weren't designing a tank to win duels. They were designing a tank to win campaigns. And campaigns are won not by the strongest machine, but by the machine that keeps fighting after the others have stopped. The small metal box inside Hayes's turret was called a gyrostabilizer. It had no dramatic name, no inspiring origin story. It was a mechanical instrument designed to do one thing: keep the Sherman's main gun steady while the tank was moving. In 1942, this was unprecedented. Every other tank in the world required a full stop before firing accurately. German crews trained endlessly to halt, acquire, fire, and move. British doctrine emphasized static defense for exactly this reason. But the Sherman could fire on the move. Not perfectly, not with sniper precision, but accurately enough to hit a target at 500 YD while rolling at 15 mph across broken ground. It sounds like a minor advantage. It wasn't. It was a revolution. Hayes didn't understand the device when he first climbed into his tank at Fort Knox. The instructors mentioned it once, maybe twice, during gunnery training. Most crews ignored it. The mechanical complexity, it required maintenance, it could malfunction, and in the chaos of combat. Who would trust a machine to aim their gun while bouncing across a battlefield? The doctrine was still evolving. The technology was still suspect. But Hayes had a gunner named Corporal Eddie Marsh who believed in machinery the way some men believe in scripture. Marsh read the technical manual. He practiced with the stabilizer every chance he got. And when their platoon deployed to North Africa in October 1942, Marsh made a quiet decision. He would leave the stabilizer engaged always, no matter what. The German tanks appeared at 7 hours on November 19th, 3 Panzer IVs cresting the ridge in a wedge formation, their long guns silhouetted against the morning sky. Hayes's platoon was moving in column along a valley road exposed and vulnerable. Doctrine said stop, disperse, and return fire. But stopping in the open meant becoming a stationary target for crews who had been fighting since Poland. Marsh didn't stop. He kept the Sherman rolling, traversed the turret smoothly to the right, and fired. The first shot missed by 10 FD. The second shot struck the lead panzer below the turret ring. The third shot missed again, but by the time the German commander had halted his tank, acquired Hayes's position, and prepared to fire, Marsh had put 2 more rounds down range. One struck tread, Another punched through sidearm. The Panzer slewed sideways and stopped. The other two German tanks fired. Both missed. American tanks don't stop, and German gunners weren't trained to lead a moving target at that range. Hayes's platoon scattered into defilade and survived. That night, Marsh sat on the rear deck of the Sherman and cleaned the stabilizer's gyroscope with a rag and gun oil. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The gyro stabilizer wasn't an accident. It was the result of a design philosophy that began in American boardrooms and engineering labs years before the war started. In 1940, while Germany was perfecting the Panzer IV and the Soviet Union was deploying the T-34, American engineers at the Rock Island Arsenal were asking a different question. Not how do we build the best tank, but how do we build a tank that ordinary men can use effectively after 6 weeks of training? The answer wasn't thicker armor or a bigger gun. It was systems. The Sherman was designed around the crew. The turret was spacious. The controls were intuitive. The engine was a mass, robust commercial design that every mechanic in America already understood. And the gyro stabilizer was the crown jewel of that philosophy. It didn't make the Sherman invincible. It made the crew capable. By December 1942, word of the stabilizer's effectiveness began filtering up through divisional reports. Tank commanders who had dismissed it as a gimmick started leaving it engaged. Gunnery scores improved. Casualty rates dropped. Crew confidence soared, but the true impact wasn't visible in after-action reports. It was visible in the psychology of combat. A Sherman crew that could fire while moving didn't just have a tactical advantage. They had momentum. They had initiative, and in armored warfare, initiative is survival. German tank commanders began reporting something strange in their intelligence summaries. American tanks were engaging at ranges and speeds that shouldn't have been possible. They were hitting targets while maneuvering. They were refusing to fight by the rules, and worst of all, they were multiplying. The Sherman's production numbers told a story that German war planners had failed to imagine. By the end of 1942, American factories were producing more than 2,000 Shermans per month. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant alone was turning out 1 tank every hour. Ford's facility in Michigan was running 3 shifts. Pfizer Body in Grand Blanc was converting automobile assembly lines into armor workshops. The Germans had built approximately 8,000 Panzer IVs between 1939 and 1943. America built 49,000 Shermans during the same period. Quantity, the German officer corps believed, would be neutralized by quality. But quantity combined with smart design was something else entirely. Every Sherman came with a gyro stabilizer. Every crew learned to use it, and every battlefield encounter reinforced the same lesson. You don't need the perfect shot if you can take 5 shots before your enemy takes one. The device itself was elegantly simple. A gyroscope spinning at high speed resisted changes in orientation. When mounted to the gun's elevation mechanism and linked hydraulically to the turret controls, it kept the barrel level regardless of the tank's pitch and roll. The gunner still aimed manually. The stabilizer simply compensated for the terrain. It wasn't automatic. It wasn't magical. It was precise engineering applied to a brutal problem, and it worked because American industry had learned to manufacture precision instruments at mass production scale. The gyroscopes were made by companies that had been producing aircraft instruments, naval fire control systems, and industrial automation equipment for decades. The hydraulic systems came from factories that built construction machinery. The whole device was an ecosystem of American manufacturing expertise crystallized into a 15 lb box. Lieutenant Hayes encountered his second revelation in January 1943 during the battle for Fed Pass. His platoon was tasked with holding a narrow defile against a German counterattack. Intelligence estimated 2 companies of panzers. The actual force was closer to a battalion. Hayes positioned his 5 Shermans in a reverse slope defense, hauled down behind a RG line with only the turrets exposed. The Germans advanced methodically, expecting the Americans to reveal their positions by firing prematurely. Hayes waited. When the 1st Panzer reached effective range, he gave the order. All 5 Shermans fired simultaneously while reversing down the slope, breaking line of sight immediately after the shot. The stabilizer allowed them to fire accurately, even while moving backward. German return fire struck dirt and rock. The Shermans repositioned, advanced back to the RG line, and fired again. This cycle repeated 11 times over 40 minutes. The Germans lost 7 tanks and withdrew. Hayes lost none. After the battle, a captured German lieutenant told his interrogators that he thought he was fighting 15 tanks, not 5. The speed of fire made it seem impossible that so few machines could generate so much accurate violence. The gyro stabilizer became a symbol, not in the grand rhetorical sense, not in propaganda posters or war bond rallies, but in the quiet conversations between tank crews in assembly areas and maintenance depots. It represented something larger than mechanics. It represented the idea that American industry could outthink an enemy even when it couldn't outgun them. German tankers prided themselves on superior engineering. Their guns were more powerful, their armor was thicker, their optics were clearer, but their tanks were also more expensive, more complex, and slower to produce. A Panther tank required 55,000 man-h hours to build. A Sherman required 10,000. When a Panther broke down, it needed specialized parts and trained technicians. When a Sherman broke down, it needed a wrench and a mechanic who understood Ford engines. The stabilizer was a microcosm of that philosophy. It was smart enough to matter and simple enough to fix. By the spring of 1943, the gyro stabilizer had become standard operating procedure in American armored divisions. Training manuals were updated. Gunnery doctrine was revised. Crews were drilled on firing while moving until it became instinct and the Germans noticed. Captured documents from panzer divisions in Tunisia included explicit warnings about American fire-on-the-move capabilities. One report from the 10th Panzer Division noted that enemy tanks demonstrate unexpected accuracy while maneuvering, suggesting either superior crew training or mechanical assistance. The report recommended increased emphasis on rapid halting and first shot accuracy, but recommendations don't change the physics of combat. German crews were already doing everything they could. The Americans had simply changed the rules. The psychological impact was harder to quantify, but no less real. A German tank commander in 1943 knew he was fighting a defensive war. He knew the Allies controlled the skies. He knew American production was limitless. And now he knew that even in the one domain where German engineering had always excelled, even in direct tank-on-tank combat, the Americans had found an edge. Not through brute force, not through lucky shots, but through systematic, reproducible, teachable capability. The stabilizer didn't make every American crew an ace. It made average crews competent and competent crews dangerous, in a war of attrition that was decisive. Hayes kept a small notebook in his tanker jacket. Most crew commanders did. They recorded kill marks, mechanical issues, and tactical observations, but Hayes used his notebook differently. He recorded moments when the stabilizer mattered. A shot fired while climbing a slope, a target engaged during evasive maneuvers, a hull-down retreat under fire. By May 1943, he had logged 63 instances where the gyro stabilizer had allowed his crew to take a shot they wouldn't have risked otherwise. Of those 63 shots, 19 resulted in confirmed hits. 19 hits that wouldn't have existed without that small metal box. 19 moments where industrial ingenuity substituted for battlefield luck. He never showed the notebook to anyone, but he never went into combat without it. The Sherman's reputation evolved slowly. In 1943, it was still considered inferior to the Panther and Tiger. In 1944, after Normandy and the Fayette's pocket, analysts began reassessing. The Sherman wasn't winning because it was better in single combat. It was winning because it was better at everything else: reliability, maintainability, crew survivability, and yes, the ability to keep fighting while the enemy was still reacting. The gyro stabilizer was part of that equation. A small part, perhaps, but small advantages compound. In June 1944, during the breakout from Normandy, American armored divisions advanced faster and farther than German commanders thought possible. They attributed it to air superiority, to logistics, to numerical advantage. All true, but also true was that American tanks could fight while moving and German tanks couldn't. The device never received public recognition. No medals were awarded for its invention. No newsreels celebrated its contribution. After the war, military historians focused on the Normandy landings, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final push into Germany. The gyro stabilizer became a footnote, a technical curiosity mentioned briefly in obscure armor journals and engineering retrospectives. But the men who fought in Shermans remembered. They remembered the feeling of firing accurately while their tank bucked over rough terrain. They remembered the confidence it gave them to maneuver aggressively instead of cowering in static positions. They remembered that the German tanks they faced were superior in almost every measurable way, except the one that mattered most. The Germans built machines to win battles. The Americans built machines to win wars. By late 1944, German TAG production was collapsing. Allied bombing had destroyed factories. Raw materials were scarce. Experienced crews were dead or captured. But even if Germany had possessed unlimited resources, the gyrostabilizer represented a gap they couldn't close. Not because the technology was secret. The Germans understood gyroscopes. They had excellent engineers. They could have designed a similar system, but they couldn't have mass-produced it. They couldn't have installed it in every tank. They couldn't have trained every crew to use it effectively. The stabilizer wasn't a wonder weapon. It was a wonder system, and systems require infrastructure, training, standardization, and trust in the men operating them. Fascist states excel at producing individual marvels. Democracies excel at producing reliable adequacy at unlimited scale. Lieutenant Hayes survived the war. He returned to Ohio in November 1945, stored his notebooks in a basement trunk, and rarely spoke about his service. In 1963, a historian researching American armor doctrine interviewed him for an oral history project. The historian asked about tactics, leadership, and combat stress. Hayes answered politely. Then, near the end of the interview, the historian asked if there was anything about the Sherman that didn't receive enough credit. Hayes paused. He thought about Marsh, who died at the Seefried mine in February 1945. He thought about the 63 moments in his notebook. He thought about the small metal box that kept spinning while everything else shook and burned and broke. The stabilizer, Hayes said. Nobody talks about the stabilizer, but that's what let us fight the way we did. That's what kept us alive. The gyro stabilizer remained standard equipment in American tanks for decades. The M26 Pershing had one. The M46 Patton had one. The M47, M58, and M60 all carried descendants of the same technology. By the 1950s, other nations began adopting similar systems. The British installed stabilizers in their Centurion tanks. The Soviets developed their own designs for the T-54 and T-55. But the Americans had a 15-year head start, 15 years of combat experience, 15 years of doctrinal refinement, 15 years of crews who understood that mobility and firepower weren't separate capabilities. They were the same capability expressed through intelligent engineering. Modern tankers learn about the gyro stabilizer in the first week of training. It's presented as a historical curiosity, a primitive ancestor of today's digital fire control systems with laser rangefinders, ballistic computers, and thermal imaging. Young soldiers listen politely and forget quickly, but veterans who fought in Vietnam, Korea, or the Gulf understand the lineage. Every stabilized gun system in existence today traces its conceptual ancestry back to that small metal box in the Sherman's turret. Every doctrine that emphasizes maneuver over static defense owes a debt to the crews who learned to trust a spinning gyroscope. Every tank that fires while moving is a descendant of a decision made in 1940 by engineers who believed that average men given the right tools could outfight exceptional soldiers burdened with inferior systems. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of World War II. That title probably belongs to the T-34 or perhaps the Panther depending on how you measure, but the Sherman was the most effective tank of the war. Effectiveness isn't about specifications. It's about results, and the results were 49-0. 0 Shermans deployed across every theater. Hundreds of thousands of crew members trained to competence in months instead of years. Thousands of engagements where American tanks fought outnumbered and won through speed, coordination, and the ability to deliver accurate fire without surrendering momentum. The gyro stabilizer was part of that equation. A small part perhaps, but small advantages compound. In June 1944, during the breakout from Normandy, American armored divisions advanced faster and farther than German commanders thought possible. They attributed it to air superiority, to logistics, to numerical advantage. All true, but also true was that American tanks could fight while moving and German tanks couldn't. There's a museum in Fort Benning, Georgia, that houses a restored M4A3 Sherman. The tank saw combat in France and Germany with the 3rd Armored Division. Its hull is scarred with scrapes and dents. The interior smells like old grease and metal, and bolted to the turret wall, still functional after 80 years, is a gyro stabilizer. Museum visitors walk past it without noticing. It's too small, too mundane. It doesn't look like the kind of thing that changes history. But history isn't changed by dramatic gestures. It's changed by incremental advantages compounded over time, applied consistently and trusted by the men whose lives depended on them. The forgotten device wasn't forgotten because it failed. It was forgotten because it succeeded so completely that it became invisible. The Sherman's ability to fire on the move became so expected, so routine, so integrated into American armor doctrine that nobody remembered it had once been revolutionary. That's the fate of all successful innovations. They vanish into the baseline. They become the standard against which future progress is measured. And the people who invented them, who installed them, who maintained them, and who trusted them in combat fade into the margins of history, not because their contribution was small, but because it was so fundamental that it became impossible to imagine the world without it. Lieutenant Hayes died in 1987. His notebook was donated to the National Archives by his daughter, who found it while sorting through his belongings. It's catalogued in Box 47 of Collection RG 319, World War II Operations Reports. Researchers almost never request it, but it's there. 63 entries documenting moments when a 15 lb box made the difference between survival and obliteration. 63 points in the calculus of industrial warfare. 63 reasons why American armor doctrine evolved the way it did. The notebook is fading now, the ink is pale, the pages are brittle, but the entries remain legible. November 19, 1942. Engaged while moving. Hit, January 8, 1943. Reverse slope withdrawal. Hit, March 22, 1943. Evasive maneuver under fire. Hit. Each entry is a small story. Each story is a life, and each life was saved by someone who believed that average men given extraordinary tools could achieve extraordinary things. The German tankers who faced the Sherman in 1943 wrote their own reports. Some survived the war and published memoirs. They described the psychological strain of fighting an enemy who seemed to violate the laws of armored combat. They mentioned the frustration of lining up the perfect shot only to have the target move at the last instant. They talk about the growing realization that American tanks weren't just numerous. They were nimble, aggressive, confident, and behind that confidence was a machine that trusted its crew as much as the crew trusted the machine. German doctrine assumed that technology served the soldier. American doctrine assumed that technology and soldier served each other. That subtle distinction multiplied across thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of engagements was the difference between fighting to preserve territory and fighting to liberate continents. The gyrostabilizer was not a secret weapon. It was documented in technical manuals. It was visible to anyone who looked inside a Sherman. German intelligence knew about it by mid-1943, but knowing about a technology and replicating its impact are different problems. The stabilizer's effectiveness didn't come from its existence. It came from the ecosystem that supported it, the factories that built it reliably, the supply chains that delivered replacement parts, the training programs that taught crews to trust it, the doctrine that encouraged aggressive maneuver, the maintenance culture that kept it operational, and the industrial base that could produce tens of thousands of them without compromising quality. Germany could have built 100 gyrostabilizers, maybe 1,000, but they couldn't have built 50, 0, and installed them in every tank. They couldn't have sustained the logistics. They couldn't have trained the crews. They couldn't have maintained the feedback loop between combat experience and factory improvement. That's what the stabilizer represented. Not a device, but a system. Not an invention, but a philosophy. By 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Sherman tanks rolled through the rubble of German cities, their stabilizers still spinning, their crews still fighting, their doctrine still evolving. The device that had seemed like a minor innovation in 1940 had become the foundation of American armored warfare. It had saved lives. It had enabled victories. It had demonstrated that engineering ingenuity applied thoughtfully and produced relentlessly could overcome raw material superiority. And then, like so many wartime innovations, it faded from public consciousness. The veterans came home. The factories retold for peacetime production. The history books focused on generals and battles. And the small metal box that kept the gun steady while the world shook was relegated to technical appendices and engineering journals. But the legacy remained. Every modern tank carries a stabilized gun. Every modern military assumes that firepower and mobility are inseparable. Every doctrine that emphasizes maneuver warfare over static defense traces its lineage back to the same insight. The Americans didn't win World War II because they had better tanks. They won because they had better systems, systems that recognized human limitations and compensated for them, systems that valued reliability over perfection, systems that trusted ordinary people to do extraordinary things when given the right tools. The gyro stabilizer was one tool among many, but it was the tool that proved the philosophy worked. There are no monuments to the gyro stabilizer, no statues of the engineers who designed it, no national holidays commemorating its first successful combat test. History remembers the dramatic and the visible. It remembers D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge and the flag raising at Iwo Jima. It forgets the quiet innovations that made those victories possible. It forgets the device that let a tank crew engage targets while maneuvering through a war zone. It forgets the men who trusted a spinning gyroscope with their lives. It forgets that wars are won not by heroes alone, but by systems that turn average soldiers into effective warriors. That's the real story of World War II. Not the story of Superman, but the story of systems designed for ordinary people. Systems that worked, systems that scaled, systems that won. Lieutenant Hayes never considered himself a hero. He did his job. He led his crew, he trusted his equipment, and he came home. The notebook he kept wasn't meant for historians. It was meant for himself. A private record of moments when the machine did what it was supposed to do, and the crew survived because of it. He never published it, never spoke about it, publicly never sought recognition. But in the margins of his entries, between the dates and the brief descriptions, there is a pattern, a quiet confidence, a belief that the system worked, that the device mattered, that the men who designed it, built it, and installed it had done something important. He didn't need the world to remember. He remembered, and that was enough. The Sherman tank fought in every theater of World War II, North Africa, Italy, France, Germany, the Pacific. It served with British, Canadian, French, and Soviet forces. It was modified, upgraded, and adapted to dozens of different combat roles. But in every variant, in every theater, in every army, the gyrostabilizer remained a constant, a baseline, a reminder that American industrial democracy had produced something unique. Not the strongest tank, not the fastest tank, but the most trusted tank. The tank that crews believed in because it was designed to help them, not to impress engineers. The tank that won wars because it understood that war is chaos, and chaos requires tools that work when everything else is failing. The device is still there in museums and archives and storage depots, still functional in some cases, still spinning when power is applied, still compensating for pitch and roll and the violence of terrain. It doesn't know it changed history. It doesn't know it saved lives. It's just a gyroscope in a metal box doing what gyroscopes do. Resisting change, maintaining orientation, keeping the gun steady while the world shakes. That's all it ever did, and that was enough, because war isn't won by perfect machines. It's won by reliable machines in the hands of determined people. And the forgotten device that changed American tank warfare was exactly that. Reliable, effective, trusted, forgotten, but still there, still spinning, still steady in the turrets of history and the margins of memory, where the quiet innovations wait for someone to remember why they mattered. If this story reminded you that history is built not just by heroes, but by the tools they trusted, consider joining us for more. There are 1,000 forgotten devices, 1,000 overlooked moments, 1,000 stories that change the course of the war in ways no one celebrates.